Basil O'Leary was Secretary of Energy at the time under President Clinton, and she had been at a press conference when a reporter in the Southwest asked Secretary O'Leary about some experiments that this reporter had heard about, where Americans during the Cold War period from the 1940s to the 40s and for the few decades beyond, had been intentionally exposed to radiation as part of our Cold War effort, basically to see what the effects of radiation were. And Secretary O'Leary said, with honesty, essentially, I've never heard of this. I don't know if this is true, but if it is true, we will look into this. And it turned out it was true. And it turned out that as they started to look into this, they realized that there was a Pandora's box, that there was an enormous amount of classified information related to these experiments that our government had done on our citizens without the citizens knowing. A variety of kinds of experiments. Some were broad intentional exposures in the environment. Some were things like irradiating the milk of children at the Fernald School, which is a few miles from here, developmentally disabled children, to see what the effect of radiation is on the human system. And the Department of Energy decided they needed an independent committee to look into this, to go through these classified documents, which were made unclassified for the first time, and what turned out to be to hire many, many historians to essentially do historical work to try to understand what was going on and what the context was. Much of the work of this advisory committee on human radiation experiments, which Ruth Faden was asked to chair, was retrospective in nature. Their job primarily was to look to see what had happened, what radiation experiments our government had conducted, and ultimately what, if anything, was owed to the American people as a result of that. At the same time, Ruth and I think the other members of the commission recognized that the more the public in the 1990s, when this work was unfolding, became aware of what had happened at the hands of our government to its citizens, the more they would want to know whether research today was actually safe or not. The advisory committee decided, I think quite wisely, to do 3 different prospective studies to try to understand what is going on in research and research ethics today, essentially in 1994, 1995. I was hired to help with one of those 3 projects. It was a project called the Subject Interview Study. I did it closely with my dear friend and colleague Jeremy Sugarman. And the project had 2 components, a large quantitative component, which Jeremy primarily led, and a large qualitative one, which I headed up, although, again, Jeremy and I worked very collaboratively on the whole thing. We did surveys in 16 hospitals across the United States, public and private hospitals from different regions, to interview patients who were either in cancer or cardiology waiting rooms, to ask them their attitudes about research, and then to find out if they believed they had ever been in research, and then we asked their permission to look at medical records to see if they had been in research. And one thing that turned out to be true that was an important finding was that people did have very positive views of research. And then we asked people who reported that they had been part of research if they were willing to take part in a longer qualitative interview. So we conducted essentially 100 interviews with people who had been part of research. And those findings ended up taking me, and I think Jeremy would probably say the same himself, in some new directions in research ethics, because what we heard as people like Chuck Litz and Paul Applebaum had documented not too long before was that these people, who again were either cancer or cardiology patients who had been in research, spoke of research as if it were their treatment, and often spoke of it as if it were the one thing that was likely to cure them or save them or allow for a miraculous discovery. There's none of that necessarily is untrue. Their being in research might have been the thing that saved them, improved their lives, turned everything around. But we had enough quotes that spoke to what people not only hoped for, but in our minds expected might happen in research, that we wanted to study that more. So that was the work for the radiation committee, and for me it was a great experience. It got me, it was really the first very large-scale project I did in research ethics, but the next NIH grant I wrote, and it was collaboratively again with Jeremy, was to look at informed consent in the phase 1 cancer setting. And it was a chance to look to see what people who are very sick and entering a kind of clinical trial that is really only offered to people who don't have good treatment options were thinking about research. And anyway, it led me more to that path.